Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. This is our weekly hour devoted to issues of particular concern to people of African descent and to others who are working together to build a better world. Recent events have deepened our understanding of just how fragile U.S. democracy is. As we know, on April the 6th, here in the United States of America, in the state of Tennessee, in my actually home city of Nashville, 3 legislators found themselves facing potential expulsion from the Tennessee state legislature. Gloria Johnson from East Tennessee, from Middle Tennessee, Justin Jones from Nashville, and Justin Pearson from Memphis. The 3 of them collectively known as the Tennessee Three. One legislator, Gloria Johnson from Knox County, narrowly escaped expulsion, but the other 2 did not. When asked why perhaps she was spared by 1 vote from expulsion, she said, well, maybe it had something to do with the color of our skin. The 2 young men were and are of African descent. All 3 were involved in a protest urging the Tennessee legislature to pass stronger gun control legislation in the wake of a massacre. 6 people, including 3 children, lost their lives in Nashville, Tennessee, as a result of an act of gun violence. So today we thought we'd explore not only recent events in Tennessee, but the longer arc of events, not just in the American South, but around the country, that speak to, I don't know whether we would call it conservatism versus liberalism, red states versus blue states, but certainly any conversation we can have here at the Black Table where we can bring in some folk to help us put us in a longer arc, we're going to do that. And so we're going to invite to the Black Table, back to the table here. We're convening a round table to help us think with and through these recent events with Kermit Roosevelt, who is the David Berger Professor for Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. You'll remember him a little while back. We had a conversation around his 2022 book, The Nation That Never Was, here. And also going to invite back to the table Richard Kreitner, journalist, essayist, critic, historian. We had a conversation here at the table on his book, Break It Up, his 2020 book. So welcome back, Richard and Kermit, to the Black Table.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. We couldn't think of 2 better people to help us put these recent events in Tennessee and other events in longer arc. I guess I'll start with you, Kermit. All these Supreme Court cases that are on the docket, and the ones that seem to be teed up. And almost recently, I was reading about this virtual charter school in Oklahoma, trying to get at that wall that separates church and state. Maybe use the First Amendment as a battering ram a little bit more, and of course, made me think about your book on judicial activism, making sense of the Supreme Court decisions and helping us walk through. What do you make of what happened here in Nashville on the 6th of April?
Well, so there's lots of different ways to understand it, and I hope we'll get to some of the different ones. But like the first thing I would say, I think, is it's showing stress on our democratic system. And it's showing really how the system that was constructed under the 1787 Constitution really wasn't designed to operate in a world of parties competing for power. So in a democracy, ideally, you would think politicians come up with ideas, and they come up with ideas that appeal to more people and, that maybe are better ideas, and that's how they get power. But what happens when you have parties competing for power is it becomes more about the power than the ideas. And the question is, what can you do that will let you take power and hold power? And this has been exacerbated recently by our increasing partisan polarization, which is sort of a consequence, I think, of the fact that political identity is now tied to a bunch of other things. So that the political parties now offer these sort of all-encompassing identities. And people feel if their party loses, it's not just a setback for particular policies they might like, but it's an existential threat to their whole sense of self.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting because and we're going to get into that as well. I mean, obviously, as you walked us through last time you were here, the framers' constitution, the founders' constitution, rather, and that Reconstruction Constitution that gives us the opportunity to perhaps write a new narrative, to live a new narrative. And I hope you'll help our viewers understand that political parties were not part of even that founding constitution. So as you walk us through, Richard, you, of course, talk about this central theme of secession. And I was watching the conversation you were having with my friend and brother and fellow Nashvilleian, Matsamela Thompson, where you were walking him through the fact that this country has a central theme of getting away from other people, including a lot of Black nationalists. I mean, nobody leaves unscathed in this project. Help us, picking up there where Kermit kind of led us. How much of this current rancor has to do with these identities that have found bounding themselves to parties, political parties, and then used our framework as a mechanism for, I don't want to say secession. I think what's the other word you use?
Disunion.
Disunion. There's the word.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the history of secession is not far from this story. The sculpture, the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Confederate general who oversaw massacres of African-American soldiers during the Civil War, was only removed from the Tennessee State House, I believe, less than 2 years ago. And the same people who expelled these representatives from the Tennessee legislature last week were responsible for making, for resisting the removal of that bust for many years. So there's a white power structure in Tennessee, in the country at large, that has got a death grip on our democracy that Professor Roosevelt is talking about, and is resisting any effort for change, for progress and greater equality, especially racial equality. So, and that resistance, as we've seen in the last several years, but also in a much longer span of American history, goes from procedural maneuvers like expelling representatives to outright violence, an insurrection. And that range of options has always been kind of available, up to and including secession, though I don't think we'll see that in Tennessee today, to this white power structure that resists any move to create a more, rich and vibrant multiracial democracy. So that history is clearly still present in these events, and that resistance to change is what motivated that expulsion last week.
Okay, so, it's interesting growing up in the South. We know that when people talk about red states and blue states, that doesn't really translate on the ground. I mean, there are a lot of different people all over the country, including littered throughout the American South. There are a lot of folks. I'm sure a lot of our viewers are trying to figure out, how in the hell could you get a super majority in a state like Tennessee, which is majority white, but not overwhelmingly white? I mean, and I'm thinking about that even in maybe perhaps, Prof, in the context of Merrill versus Milligan and this cracking and packing conversation that's before the Supreme Court now. Could you help viewers understand how you could even end up with a quote unquote super majority in a state like Tennessee?
Yeah, sure. So I was going to say, we talk about red states and blue states. Why do we talk about it? Because of the Electoral College. So it's an artifact of the way that our political system is structured, that we think about it in terms of states at the state level. You could think about it in terms of, congressional districts or districts for state representatives. But there again, it's artificial, right? It's constructed based on the way our political system works, which is the party system. And so in a lot of states, you have, as Richard was saying, gerrymanders. So it's possible to draw districts so that your party gets a minority of the votes for representatives to Congress, but elects a majority of representatives. And we've seen states do that. And so again, this sort of ties into what I was saying before. We're increasingly moving towards a system where power is not a means to an end to implement your desired policies, which then are supposed to have support in a democracy. It's more that power is the end in itself. And that's because the other party is increasingly seen as the enemy. So on both sides, there's sort of a genuine, sincere fear. And I think it's more well-founded on one side than the other. I think probably people on both sides feel that way about their side. But there is sincere fear on both sides.
Richard, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Sure. Well, I mean, I agree that the problem is gerrymandering. That's how you get a supermajority in a state where otherwise the numbers would not be nearly as out of whack as they are in Tennessee. So that's kind of a structural problem, and especially given the conservative takeover of our judiciary in the last decade or two, it's one that's become pretty much impossible to dislodge. It's hard to see our way out of that, other than through some kind of political revolution that changes things in a more fundamental level. The representation of the states, to take up Professor Roosevelt's point, is not only, of course, in the Electoral College, but in the Senate, perhaps more importantly, where the very Constitution of 1787 enshrines the equal status of the states in having 2 votes in the Senate, and that's unamendable, according to the Constitution itself. That's kind of, as gerrymandering, creates undemocratic outcomes of our elections at the state and local level. That provision for equal apportionment of votes in the Senate creates it at the national level, where I think it's something like 11%, senators representing something like 11% of voters can actually block legislation thanks to the filibuster. So I think that people who care about democracy need to be, yes, we should be outraged about these new developments of this kind of anti-democratic impulse that has really taken root on the right, but we also need to recognize the deep historical roots of that and the ways in which it kind of has infected our system right from the very beginning, and in ways that the founders themselves, like James Madison, who opposed that equal votes for each state in the Senate predicted would eventually lead to some kind of collapse of our constitutional structure. And I think that might be what we're looking at in the years ahead.
Oh, well, you know what? I think that's a good place to pause for a break and come back because we're going to look, where should our eyes turn to look for help? And when we come back, Professor Roosevelt, Kermit, I hope you'll maybe help us think about where we might look for some assistance as we try to organize to try to check some of this power mad lust between the two parties. So we'll be back here at the Black Table in a moment, here on the Black Star Network.
Up next on The Frequency with me, Dee Barnes, we're going to talk to Leslie Segar, a.k.a. Big Les, and talk about her incredible career as a dancer, choreographer, and DJ of Rap City.
Magic Johnson was there, so half the NBA was there. Iman the supermodel, so all the supermodels were there every day. Actors,
Right.
like it was a who's who of who's who.
Right here on The Frequency in the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We're having a conversation today with returning guests, Kermit Roosevelt and Richard Kreitner, putting the recent events in the state of Tennessee and the Tennessee legislature in a longer historical arc and helping us think through what our options are as we continue to try to create a better society. Prof, as Richard was talking about this question of, the possibilities of potential revolution and the things, political revolution and things that might be a check on that, how do you think about the mechanisms of government? I mean, where could we look more fruitfully for some form of intervention? Would it be the executive, the judiciary? Would it be the presidential, the executive? I'm thinking about Jamal Green, your colleague Jamal Green, who's up at Columbia and wrote a recent book, How Rights Went Wrong. And he says, maybe we're relying too much on the courts. But as Richard said, maybe we shouldn't even be relying on the courts at all. I mean, what role do the courts play in where we find ourselves today?
Well, so, one of the things that people forgot for a while with the Warren Court was that historically the Supreme Court has not been a force for progress. Historically, the Supreme Court tends to represent and protect the interests of the elite. And currently the Supreme Court, you've got a 6-3 Republican supermajority, despite the fact that Republicans have not won a majority of presidential elections going back to when these justices were appointed. So there's a sort of malapportionment there. It's come about in part because of the malapportionment in the Senate, which favored the Republicans. It's come about in part because of strategic retirements and accidents of, justices dying unexpectedly. One of the reforms that I'm most interested in, that I've really been working towards, is term limits for Supreme Court justices, which, if they were implemented, would eventually bring control of the Supreme Court back in line with the outcome of presidential elections. Now, even that doesn't get you the popular will, because, of course, the Electoral College allows people to win the presidency while losing the popular vote. So I think reforming the Electoral College would also be a good idea. There's an idea out there, the National Popular Vote Compact, which effectively does an end run around the Electoral College without amending the Constitution. So there are a lot of things that can be done. The question really, and it's a hard one, I think, is where do you start? Sort of what levers of democracy are still within our reach? Which ones haven't been taken away yet? Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to stop a majority of people from actually being able to control the country.
Yeah, it's interesting as you said, power just to pursue power for the pursuit of power being its own end. I know we all saw in Mississippi recently, Cindy Hyde objected to the appointment of a black judge that the Republican governor had endorsed and the Republican establishment had endorsed in Mississippi. I think it's Scott Cullum for the Northern District level judge. And there was no good reason. She cited his defense of transgender rights. And I mean, so, and I know, you served on obviously the presidential commission, as we talked about last time, looking at the judiciary and these possible remedies. in a situation where, as you said, it's really an arbitrariness. This wasn't even party politics. This was just like, what are you doing? All the Republican leadership in your state endorsed this judge, and then you turn around and say, no, I'm just gonna. And of course, threatening the blue slips, challenges to federal judges. What, like I say, if the challenge is where to start, where would you recommend folk who are reading this saying this is just hopeless, this is just arbitrary, and there's nothing we can do? Where are some of the places you might recommend we start to try to move toward pushing politicians to be able to enact some of these I hate to call them reforms, changes, we might say, in policy?
Well, I think the easiest place to start is the lowest level. So you can start at the city level, you can start at the county level, and obviously, like, cities are a better environment, generally speaking, for progressive politics. So in terms of what the cities can do, within their states, I think starting at the lower level is probably the easiest way to do it.
That's good. That's good to know, because Richard, it makes me think about the fact that in the state of Tennessee, for example, Nashville is, relatively speaking, a progressive city. And we know, of course, that the legislature has intervened to break up the congressional district. They're threatening to shrink the city council. Apparently, the Republican Party leadership called the city of Memphis city council, the mayor, who's been kind of quiet over the last few days since they reappointed Pearson the other day, and threatened their funding for municipal projects. What do you think about what Kermit raises?
Well, I mean, regarding the fight between national, somehow the Republican Party and the conservative movement is always defending local rights and local prerogatives, except in the case where they have control of the larger entity, and the smaller entity is either a blue state under the Trump administration, or a blue city underneath a red governor in a red state, so-called. So there's this wanton hypocrisy across the board of supporting local autonomy when it suits you, and supporting big state or big federal power when that's in your interests. I get a lot of interview requests about this movement in Eastern Oregon to secede from Oregon and join Idaho, a more amenable, conservative country for those people who live out in Eastern Oregon. You never hear anybody in the Republican Party, needless to say, raising support for Nashville's secession from Tennessee, because it's so important that people in Nashville, especially people of color, have self-determination. I think as the professor was saying at the very beginning, this divide between power and ideas, the ideas have become so hollowed out and so watered down and totally ignored when it suits their interests, that all you are left with is this kind of thirst for power and this willingness to embrace any ideology of any kind, so long as it suits your purposes. I think we're seeing something similar with Ron DeSantis in Florida, where you support corporate rights and the free market, except when they oppose you on some kind of social issue. And I just think it's important, as for where to start, I hardly know. But I just think it's important to call out that kind of hypocrisy whenever we see it, and to connect the dots, between these structural issues like gerrymandering and the constitutional imperatives and the Electoral College. The Democratic Party, for instance, only remembers to dislike the Electoral College every 4 years when they realize that either they have lost the presidential race despite winning the popular vote, or that they might. And then there's about a week where people say, hey, yeah, we should do something about that. And then they completely forget about it, after, say, Biden wins the election. I think there needs to be some kind of bundling together of all these grievances, a little bit of memory as well, and putting some kind of structural package together saying these are our problems and this is how we address it.
It's interesting. Couple of things come to mind. I'll ask you about that, both about the education question in a moment, because one of the reasons we're doing this work and adding our voices to the many out there who are trying to do work like this is to get the general public much better informed, so that we can think about strategies to change the conditions. Thinking about Nashville, and as you were talking, Richard, the idea of the pursuit of power, and nobody's saying Nashville should secede, but we've seen in recent memory, over the arc of the last year plus, Candace Owens has relocated to Nashville. The Republican Party pushed to have the Republican National Convention in Nashville. Now, what does that say to you in terms of strategy? Even now, going perhaps after some of these, to use the red-blue context, blue cities in these red states, Atlanta or Jackson, Mississippi, which of course we've seen the battle there in Jackson, or New Orleans, or Birmingham, Montgomery, Alabama. I mean, what is the strategy as it relates to these pockets, islands, oases, however you want to characterize them, of blue in these red states? How do you read that?
I mean, as far as I can tell, it's the desire to harness these large numbers of people, which give you power in Congress, numbers of people, the very large and growing and diverse cities in Texas, and yet to disempower them and prevent their voices from being heard. In that sense, it's a continuation of something like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which tried, again, to harness large numbers of people who were enslaved and yet use those numbers for representation of their masters, of their purported owners, and I think I feel like that's kind of an inflammatory comparison, but I think there's a similar kind of drive there to get as much power as you can in the name of people whom you supposedly represent, but whom you don't really represent whatsoever. Quite the opposite. It seems to me that that's part of what's going on in Nashville, and I think in Texas especially, where you have these huge cities and they're just trying to chop up the neighborhoods as much as they can to dilute, representation.
Yeah, and we know, of course, as you say, the elected officials are doing that, and increasingly they're representing fewer and fewer people. Currently, you've written about this. I mean, obviously, the impact of not having everybody involved in the political process engaged fully. And we heard Richard mention, of course, Andrew DeSantis, and it made me think about all of these attempts to disenfranchise folk. Tennessee, for example, has perhaps the strictest laws preventing reinstatement of voting rights for those who have been incarcerated. I mean, what about this campaign to shrink the electorate? How do you read that in the context of what we're seeing going on there?
Well, so I think Richard was exactly right to bring up the 3/5 compromise. And, he said it was inflammatory, but I think historically it's the same pattern. It's the same value, right? So the idea is we're going to hold political power. We're not going to represent the interests of all the people we're supposed to represent, but we're going to have more power because those people are there. And we're going to keep them in a state of powerlessness, within our political unit. So this is the states trying to take away power from the cities while counting the city population for their representation in Congress. And what is that historically? That is the 3/5 compromise, where the southern states say we get more representatives because we have more people, even though obviously they're not representing the interests of those people. And all of this, concentration of power in the hands of a smaller number of people who don't represent the interests of the majority, all of this is, sort of a slightly quieter replay of the pre-Civil War American political system.
That's man. I mean, it paints a bleak kind of landscape, but it also, I don't know if it's strange in that there almost seems like there's a hope somewhere in the seed of that ultimately this will be pushed to the point where we have to respond out of our common humanity. It almost feels like the blues a little bit. When Marcella's brother Brandon said, when I hear the blues, I don't get sad, I get happy. It's like there's something in there. I think we're going to get at it a little bit more in the second half of our conversation. We'll be back in a moment. We're going to take a break. And when we come back with Kermit Washington and Richard Crichton, we're going to continue to pursue the meaning of what you've seen recently in Tennessee, from all sides and all angles, back here at the Black Table.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Hold no punches.
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network across all platforms. Download the app, join the Brain Funk fan club, make a donation, and tell everyone about these conversations that we're having at the network. Support all the shows. So we're back here at the Black Table with Richard Kreitner and Kermit Roosevelt. Prof, I want to ask you about education. Richard, as you were saying, one of the things we have to do is begin to spread this information, try to, intensify our conversations and have more people know how the process works and how we got here. Again, I was thinking about this recent Oklahoma case. Well, it's not a case yet. They want to open a virtual Catholic school in Oklahoma, and they want the state to pay for it. A charter school that will be used, the public funds will be used. In Tennessee, we saw recently the Tennessee legislature threaten my alma mater, Tennessee State University, trying to withhold funds, trying to disband their board of trustees, attacking their president, saying that there are funding questions that they want, not funding questions, accounting questions they want answered, and something's wrong with the books. Of course, the person leading that charge, Jason Mumpower, is the same comptroller who was the central figure in trying to take over Mason, Tennessee, and West Tennessee once the Carr plant was decided it was going to be planted there. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about interfering with education. Now, we know there is no state religion in this country, but we also know the Supreme Court seems to have given a wink and a nod through the First Amendment to eroding the separation of church and state, and perhaps facilitating, as you were saying earlier, this relationship between identity and power and political party and power. How have the courts, are you concerned at all about how the courts may be helping to facilitate, the federal courts at any rate, some attempt, I don't want to go so far as to call it a theocracy, but some attempt to have this kind of minority attitude become not just a live and let live, everybody, no, but to impose a certain type of identity and philosophy on everybody in the country. And if people don't go along, perhaps try to erode their capacity to even educate themselves.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like the common thread in all of this, I would say, is minority rule, right? And minority rule has a history in our country, and it's a racialized history, and people need to be aware of that. The current manifestation is not exactly the same, but it's got a lot of similarities. And definitely, I think the Supreme Court is not helping. So, on racial issues, on voting rights issues, on religious issues, generally speaking, the current Supreme Court is facilitating minority rule. And it is frustrating the will of the majority, and it's helping states, or it's permitting states to do that. And then it's also stopping the federal government from interfering, because we had, some very helpful laws out there, the legacy of the Second Reconstruction. We had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that's basically gone now because of the Supreme Court. So, one of the things that I try to stress to people is it's not just that the Supreme Court is standing back and letting states do what they want. It's also actively taking the anti-democratic side here. Oh. It's dismantling attempts by the federal government to protect voting rights.
You know what? That's Prof, help us with that as well, because I mentioned earlier we had a legal roundtable a little while back with Angie Porter and Malika Watkins, and they were talking about Merrill versus Milligan in Alabama. We've seen, of course, the recent victory of Judge Janet Protasiewicz in Wisconsin, and a threat, however idle it may or may not be, from the Wisconsin legislature to impeach her. And I'm reminded, and you'll know the case immediately, the Wisconsin case, what was it, Gorsuch? You were saying, no, this isn't justiciable. This is a political issue. Redistricting and gerrymandering is a political issue, not a racial issue. When you say the Supreme Court isn't helping, in fact, that in some ways it's helping facilitate this kind of thing, how concerned are you that there will be any left of Voting Rights Act after this current term? Or maybe I'm stating it too. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's not much left of the Voting Rights Act. And, the thing we need to worry about is like the next step down that road, actually, which is the independent state legislature doctrine. So the question is whether the Supreme Court is actually going to do what some Republican activists want, which is sort of hand over control of the state's electoral votes to these gerrymandered legislatures, because the Constitution, and this is a fact, it's part of our anti-democratic Constitution. The Constitution says states shall appoint electors in such manner as the legislature shall direct. And if you read that very expansively, You could say if the legislature decides the popular vote didn't come out right, or they have no confidence in the way the election was conducted, they can just certify their own electors. And if you do that, then all of these battleground purple states, places like North Carolina or Wisconsin, suddenly switch red because their legislatures are gerrymandered and they're controlled by the minority. That's a big threat that people are worried about.
No question. I'm glad you said that, because Professors Watkins and Porter talked about Moore versus Harper. Are you concerned at all that they are actually going to endorse? I mean, obviously we saw Alito gesture toward it even during the election of 2020. I mean, do you think they have the numbers? Well, they have the numbers, certainly the conservative supermajority, but are you at all concerned that the independent state legislature doctrine is about to become law in this country?
Well, I would still bet against it. It seems crazy. There are very distinguished originalist scholars filing briefs at the Supreme Court saying this is nonsense as a matter of original understanding. So I hope not. But, I got to say the past 20 years or so, all the way back to Bush v. Gore, I have consistently thought, no, the Supreme Court can't possibly do this terrible thing. And then they've gone ahead and done it.
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons we wanted to have the two of you all on together is because Richard, you every page and break it up is like, this is what they do. So I mean, to have the both of you, I'm kind of like you, Prof. No, they couldn't. But then Richard's like, what are you talking about? This would be a precedent. The only precedent would be if they didn't do it this way. So what do you think, Richard? I mean, can this go so far beyond the pale that more reasonable voices, whether it be, I know the case now in Texas where the district judge blocked the availability of the abortion medicine, and all the pharmaceutical companies, even the ones that don't produce the medicine, are like, no, if they do this, that means they can ban any drug through the FDA. What do you think? Can they go too far, Richard?
I think they certainly can. I share Professor Roosevelt's, observation that you think that they're not going to go that far, and then they absolutely do. I think it's a very sobering kind of reminder of how close we are really to the brink of a true kind of autocratic government in this country, and the whole question that I ask in the book and don't quite answer because I'm tentative about it is what do we do then? What is the option when you run out of options? And in American history, there's one, which is separation of some kind. I mean, I'd be curious, having the two of us together. I know Professor Roosevelt's story about the Revolutionary era Constitution and then the Constitution of the Civil War. And we were talking before we came on about this article I wrote about the Constitution and abolition in the Civil War, where you at some point you have to look at the fact that the closest we've ever got to true equality in this country came after a civil war, and what does that say about the hope that you were talking about earlier, Professor Carr? What hope can we have in this country short of some kind of radical break with the existing constitutional structure? And what does that break look like, and how bad does it get?
Prof, jump in, please. That last chapter of yours, that new narrative, man, is a compelling vision for the country. You said you almost named your book. What was it? America, Let America Be America Again, from Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. What you think, Prof, in terms of what Richard laid out?
Well, so it's true. Like there's a debate about the founders' constitution and the 1787 Constitution. Was it pro-slavery? Was it anti-slavery? Did it contain the seeds for the end of slavery? And people spend a lot of time talking about anti-slavery interpretations of the Constitution in the years before the Civil War. And all of that's true. There was anti-slavery constitutionalism. But the controlling opinion in 1858 about what the Constitution meant was Dred Scott. It was this virulently pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, brought about because you had pro-slavery justices appointed by pro-slavery presidents, elected because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. And the thing that ended slavery, of course, was the Civil War and military occupation of the South and dissolution of the Southern governments and amendments imposed basically by military force. So like when we talk about minority rule and the Three-Fifths Compromise, we've seen this historically. We sort of got past it. We took away the Three-Fifths Compromise, but we did it because of a war. And we do have to understand that. Now, there's things I'd like to try before war, because I think there's a great idea out there that really is responsive to the problem. So I'd like to talk about that in a second, like maybe the next time.
Well, tease us right now, and then we'll go to break. We'll come back with that because we're going to spend this fourth block kind of helping us walk it out. What's on your mind, Prof? What do you think might be a better?
Okay.
Obviously not fighting.
Okay. So I'm going to give you just like the short pitch.
Yes.
Before we go into the break. So the problem I've been saying is minority rule. Like we've got a small group of extremists in control. Well, where does that happen the most, and why does it sort of translate into the national level? It happens the most in party primaries because not a lot of people vote in party primaries, and they tend to be the extreme people. So couple the party primary system with a system we have where most districts are safe. Most congressional districts are not really contested. They're safe for one party or the other. And you reliably have extremists, and not just on one side, extremists from both sides being appointed. And then extremists end up in control of the party. And extremists end up driving the national conversation. And that's part of the problem. So minority rule is part of the problem. Extremists is part of the problem. You could think of primary voters as the extreme minority that's exerting an outsized influence over our politics. And the question is, how do you give power back to the majority?
You know what? It's a good place to pause.
Good cliffhanger.
No question. No question. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Professor Kermit Roosevelt is going to give us the key to how we get out of this mess. And then Richard Kreitner is going to give his thoughts on how we do that. And we will have solved everything by the end of this hour here on the Black Table. So we'll be back in a moment here on the Black Star.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, joined today by Richard Kreitner and Kermit Roosevelt. We're having a conversation about recent events in Tennessee and what it tells us about race in this country, and more importantly, how we build a better society and some very practical steps to doing that. So, Prof, where we left off, you were talking about these non-contested seats and the primaries and how the primary seems to be the source of the problem. You know better than I do. You know, the history, of course, of the war that was waged, the legal war that was waged in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Nixon versus Carr, and of course, Dr. Gamillion down there in Tuskegee, Alabama, the whole fight to break into the Democratic Party because the white primary was the problem. So how do you break this primary business up, Prof?
Well, so you have to change the system. And the answer is something called Final Five voting, which I just learned about recently. Look it up online. And I learned about this. I was like, it can't be that easy. You know, it can't be that one relatively minor change is going to fix all of these problems, but it kind of does. So it's really amazing. What you do is you have an open primary. So parties can endorse people if they want, whatever, but you've got an open primary. The top 5 finishers go on to the general election. So easily you can have one Democrat, one Republican. You can have people from other parties. You're not excluding any parties. It's actually more inclusive. And then in the general election, you have ranked choice voting with instant runoffs. So you don't just say your top pick, you take these 5 people, you rank them 1 through 5. And then after the first round of voting, the person who's in last place is eliminated. And all of the people who voted for that person as their first choice, you go down to their second choice, and then you count those votes. So what this ends up with is someone gets a majority, and you know where those votes came from. And you've got a candidate who actually appeals to a majority of the voters, and you let third parties in there, and people can vote for the third parties and indicate their support for them without throwing away their vote. So you don't need to worry about picking the lesser of two evils. You can pick the person you really like. And in the end, what this does is, like I was saying, it takes power away from the small number of extremists who control the primaries, and it gives it to the larger number of people who should be determining the general election, but don't because they've got no one to vote for.
It makes so much sense that it's, I mean, you know who it reminds me of? Prof, your colleague, albeit ancestral colleague, there in West Philly, the great Lonnie Guinier. I think I remember her talking about possibilities of ranked choice voting and, like you said, nonpartisan primaries. And one of the things they attacked her for, and the Clintons backed up off of her appointment in the Justice Department back in the day. Richard, what do you think about that?
I like it a lot. I mean, it combines two reforms that I've long thought make a lot of sense, which is open primaries and ranked choice voting. It makes a lot of sense, and you would kind of guarantee that whoever won has the most broad-based support, has indeed true majoritarian support, not merely support of a plurality of voters, which is how most politicians are elected. I would maybe combine that with, I think compulsory voting is also kind of a good idea. But America has such a broken political culture and a worship of the Constitution that has prevented us from enacting any kind of sensible, reforms in the past. Not any, but very few. That I somewhat despair, and not to commit too much to despair because one wants hope, but I somewhat despair of America being mature enough to embrace and see the merits of such a proposal. But it sounds pretty good to me. I've long kind of supported the idea of a constitutional convention. It's hard to see something like that passing in any other context. But I think that sounds pretty good. And I'd love to read more about that.
And we've seen it, haven't we, at the local level? Like you say, as you were saying, start locally. What you think? You nod your head. Give us a couple of examples of how this has worked out, if you got some.
Yeah, well, so this is not my idea. I'm not the expert on it. Like Final Five voting, look it up. You'll find the resources online. But they've tried it. They've tried it in some places. They tried it in Alaska. I think they've been trying it in Maine, and it works. And people understand the idea when you explain it to them, and people like it too, because one thing that Americans do believe in is democracy. People don't like the idea that a small minority of extremists is driving policy in this country. If it turns out that sort of supports their views and you bring a partisan element into it, then it gets harder. But fundamentally, most Americans do like the idea that popular support and getting the most votes and having the most people, behind you is what determines who gets to lead the country.
Interesting. So, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. Certainly, we know in the wake of the Dobbs decision, that's a centerpiece that is maybe peeling away some of the folks who might naturally vote closer to the right. They're saying, yeah, but we should leave people alone. We certainly saw it in Judge Protasiewicz's her election in Wisconsin. But how do we then approach the protection of minority rights in this country? I mean, North Dakota passed legislation now, adding, I think, 19 states now going after transgender students or transgender folk participating in high school and elementary school athletics. How do we guarantee the protection of the minority in a society where, that has been at the root of part of American identity too, particularly when we start talking about race and gender? Either one of y'all. Oh yeah.
Well, so protection of minority rights in American history is sort of a difficult topic, and I think the story is not as happy as we like to believe. So we like to believe that the Supreme Court protects the unpopular minority, but it doesn't really do that. The Supreme Court has a bad record with respect to minorities who are unpopular at a national level. Where the Supreme Court looks good, and again, this is basically a relatively brief historical moment with the Warren Court, but where the Supreme Court looks good is protecting minorities who are accepted at a national level and sort of enforcing the national consensus against outlier states. So you've got some states or you've got some localities where prejudiced attitudes persist, even though they've been rejected by the national majority or the elite consensus. And then the Supreme Court will enforce that elite popular opinion, which maybe is 10 years ahead of the rest of the country or something, if you look historically at the way identity-based movements for equality have worked. But the Supreme Court will enforce the views of a national majority against outlier states. It's pretty good at doing that. If you want to try to really protect unpopular minorities, it's very hard. Like the way you do that really is through grassroots organization and social movements that change people's minds. The courts and the government are not very good tools for it.
Man, as you talking, I think about unpopular minorities, or at least maybe forgotten minorities too. This case on the docket now that's been argued, the Brackeen case versus Holland and Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, that Texas case, trying to kick the teeth out of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And, you know, just listening to the oral argument, Samuel Alito says, as they were saying, out his mouth, well, they were fighting each other before the Europeans came. Talking about the Native Americans. I mean, you know, the whole idea that there are unpopular minorities, so to speak, and that, you know, guaranteeing minority rights begins with their rights, as Dr. King and others might say. Richard, you know, what do you think is our prospect of having some success at beating back this kind of intolerance that's at the root of the American project? And when you mention constitutional conventions, every few months we see another article or something else about this idea that this group is inching closer, whoever they are, to the possibility of trying to call a constitutional convention, but not the one you're talking about, something quite different.
Right. I mean, I think this all connects back to what we were talking about earlier with education. You know, why are we having such fierce battles over critical race theory these days and, banning books in schools is because when people know their American history, if you read back over the founding and the compromises and surrenders really that were embedded in the document and in the founding of the country in the first place, and the long struggles and the brutal assaults on Black people trying to seize their rights, from the coup in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 to today, when you have people reading about their history, knowing where they came from, knowing where the resistance to equality comes from, people start to wake up. The idea that the concept of being woke has become so controversial, as if we should all be asleep, I think is very revealing. So I think, as Professor was saying, social movements is the way to kind of enlighten people's minds and get them working together. And I think literacy and historical literacy is a very important component of it. As for the right-wing constitutional convention push, I've kind of long advocated for the left to embrace it and have some kind of open dialogue at a convention about these structural problems in our constitutional system, about the possible solutions like this form of voting that might quiet the temperature and kind of get us past this era where it seems like the country is just completely ungovernable. It reminds me of 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention, where there's this huge pile of crises in the country and divides and near civil war, and the Constitution of the United States at the time, the Articles of Confederation, was completely unamendable. That's kind of the moment that it seems like we're in today, and I think that if we really do believe in self-government, then we need to be willing to take a look at the foundational charter and figure out what's working and what kind of mechanisms need to be introduced today to reclaim that idea of democracy.
That I haven't heard anybody articulate that. So embrace the push for the Constitutional Convention and have the fight there. I mean, and what do you think, Prof, of that? It could get us closer to you having a debate, at least. I don't know.
Have the fight, right? Have the fight is something that I really agree with. So if you look at a couple of aspects of our culture, our veneration of the Constitution and the push that's going on now to exclude divisive concepts from public education, you can put sort of an innocent spin on that, like, oh, we love the Constitution, we think it's great, and we don't want people to feel bad about America. We don't want people to feel guilty. But I've come to believe that there's, a sinister aspect, and I guess this is probably obvious to a lot of people, but I think there's a sinister aspect to that too, which is it's trying to defend the status quo by telling people everything is okay, right? There's nothing to worry about. And you see this explicitly in some of those public education bills where they're like, teachers must say Americans have always fought racism and inequality, and that's sort of a deviant thing that America naturally resists. Because the point of that is to make people complacent and think you don't have to do anything. America naturally progresses towards justice. But I think if you look at our history, that's what we see is not true, because compromises tend to favor inequality, and conflict is when the forces of equality actually prevail. So like the Civil War is the super dramatic example of that. We've got all of these compromises before the Civil War, but we're really not making much progress in opposing slavery. And then the conflict erupts and look, we win. And, ultimately, I believe the numbers are on our side and the principles are on our side. And I do think that if push comes to shove, the forces of equality win.
That would be the acid test. I tell you, listen, first of all, thank you all for taking a few minutes out of both of your busy schedules to join us again here at the table. And I think this last block, all right, viewers, y'all need to spread this. We might need to chop that out and put this last 10 minutes up for people to talk about. I think you may have broken some news. That will be a hell of a fight. And I got to believe that, yes, those of us who know and understand our shared humanity, I think we do have the numbers to win that fight. That's a hell of a proposition. All right, Richard. So I expect both of you all will be at the convention. I'll meet y'all there. So, thanks again, Professor Kermit Roosevelt and Mr. Richard Kreitner. You all really do us a great service. And so thanks for joining us again on the Black Star Network.
Thanks, Dr. Carr.
Of course. We'll be back in a moment to clear the table and get ready for next week here at the Black Table.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds. As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr. We spent the last hour with Richard Kreitner and Kermit Roosevelt putting the recent events in the state of Tennessee and the Tennessee State Legislature in a much broader arc of American history. And we closed out there with quite a bang. Everybody watching, you have to get involved if you want to have a different society. And we just were introduced to the possibility of a path that might just be the way to go. Let's think about that. I'll close here and clear the table by reminding us that the two Justins, the two of the Tennessee three, were not, Justin Jones of Nashville and Justin Pearson of Memphis, were not the first two black legislators to face being put out of a state legislature in the United States of America. Two names come most immediately to mind. One, of course, is the great Henry McNeil Turner. In 1868, he was not allowed to take his seat in the Georgia State Legislature, the Reconstruction Legislature there in Atlanta. And he gave a very famous speech that my friend and brother Andre Johnson out of Memphis, University of Memphis, has provided easy access to with his work on the speeches of Henry Turner, who said, God himself would not come and send an angel out of heaven to come down here and pass judgment on me. Why would I let you all who are trying to expel me from this legislature pass judgment? He stood, and that, of course, was during Reconstruction. Henry Turner, who helped start the Georgia Equal Rights League with the grandfather of Martin Luther King. And the other name that comes to mind is a native Nashvilleian, actually. A man born in Nashville, came from several generations of freedom fighters in this country. And that, of course, was the great Julian Bond. When the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came out against the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s, Julian Bond ran for office in a newly created state legislative district coming out of Atlanta. And when he won his seat in 1965, they refused to seat him in the Georgia legislature because they said he supported the anti-Vietnam stance of SNCC. And he said, indeed, he did. And Julian Bond went to court And his case, the famous case of Bond versus Floyd, made it all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1966, the Supreme Court said you have a First Amendment right to express yourself, and they cannot deny you from taking your seat. And after winning a special election and then winning another election, Julian Bond finally achieved his seat in the Georgia State Legislature. What we've heard today from Kermit Roosevelt and Richard Kreitner is not only a compendium of the challenges we face here in the United States of America to creating a different type of society, but ways that we have shown that we have the ability, if we have the will, to forge solutions to creating a better society. So we'll see you next week here at the Black Table. And thank you for joining us this week. Again, support the Black Star Network. Tell your friends, download the app, join the Bring the Funk Fan Club, donate, support us in all ways and all the shows. And we'll see you next week.